In the last episode of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, we got the closest we've ever gotten to an actual honest-to-God plot twist. Lizzie did such a good job sneaking out of Lakeside, she also managed to escape her own chapter, leaving Rachel to handle her finale for her. We'll have to find out what became of her later. In the meantime, it's finally time to deal directly with the man we've been orbiting for the last 3 chapters.
There's data coming through faster than I can encode it. I've already lost 2 processors. They keep burning out.
Please, I love you. You need to get out of there. It's not safe.
I need you, Stephen. I need you here. I can open the gate manually. I can let you in.
It's too dangerous. You don't understand what's happening out
No,
here.
you don't understand. We can solve this. We can find a way. I just need more power. I need to amplify the signal, and I can't do it on my own. You saw the opportunity. You ran the numbers, remember?
We're responsible for all this. You and me.
It's not just you and me anymore, though, is it?
Jesus, Kate, you're trying to talk to it, aren't you? Kate, you can't.
Stephen, I have to.
Stephen has, of course, been popping up all over the valley in the course of the previous chapters. When the event began, he was the only one who had any idea what was really going on, and what the implications were. Accordingly, he spent most of that time in a state of rising panic.
It's completely dead, it won't start.
It's only a short walk to the camp. I think we should split up. You go and fetch Rachel, I'll go back to the village and find Evie.
I don't think we should split up.
I don't want to either, Charlie, but we've got to. I'll meet you back at my house later on, okay? We can talk properly then.
Why won't you tell me what happened?
No, actually, you should stay at the camp tonight. Come and find me in the morning. Bring Rachel back, she's gonna need her mother.
Meg.
Just take care of her.
Meg!
What is it, Charlie?
Nothing. Just be careful, that's all.
I will, I promise. You as well. I'll see you later on.
Back in the first video in this series, we saw the beginning of a plot thread in which Charlie, Meg, and Sam Baker decide to take a truck and collect supplies from a warehouse to bring back to the village. It seems fair to assume that we're now seeing the end of that plot thread, and you might have noticed that Sam doesn't seem to be there. I mentioned at the time the difficulty of placing the events in this plot thread onto a greater timeline of all the other events in the game. The problem with trying to make a timeline of all the stuff in this game is that because we're only seeing what are essentially just audio logs, there aren't often a lot of explicit clues as to the timing of these events. I've done my best to put everything in order based on the implicit information available, but often what you're seeing at the right side of the screen during these conversations is really only my best guess. We can get a pretty good idea of the general order of things, but that often only gets us so far.
Why on earth are you there? Why aren't you calling from home?
It's hard to explain. I'm having to move around to follow it. When it finds a suitable host, it begins to amplify. Sorry, I'm not making much sense.
They're talking about flu and a quarantine on the radio, but this... I know you're not that kind of doctor, but it all just sounds really weird.
We don't know exactly what it is yet, but it's got something to do with the other night.
Stephen, your face, the mark, do you think you're infected?
It's not a disease, Lizzie. It's something else. There's something Kate said about patterns. I can't grasp it clearly yet.
Okay, come over. Have some lunch. We can talk properly. Have you spoken with Kate?
She's locked herself in the observatory. She's buried in the data. But it's already out here in the world. I need to see how it adapts.
How what adapts? Stephen tried to explain.
Time's up. Lizzie, listen. Be ready. I need to go. It's moving again. I'll call you later.
One of the biggest point-blank questions that I just have absolutely no answer to is exactly how much time passes between the initial thing with the telescopes in the observatory and the airstrike arriving. Is it days or is it weeks? I have no idea. The most precise I've been able to get with the timeline is dividing it into a beginning, middle, and end of the event. We can, somewhat tenuously, define these periods in relation to the quarantine, going from beginning to middle when the quarantine was enacted, and going from middle to end when it became apparent that it was never going to work. And even then, there's a limit to the utility of these delineations, especially if you're trying to use them to explain this game's plot to people.
Do you think she'll like it?
It's in an awful state, Stephen. I don't think
It'll be an
she'll...
adventure. It'll mean putting down roots here, maybe a family.
Are you sure she wants children? What, to stay here? It's not her place, you know.
Don't start that again, please.
I mean, she's ambitious, love, and she's, well, older. She's not going to want to stay cooped up at home looking after the kids.
Is that how you felt about me?
Oh, stop it, Stephen. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm just saying you should make a choice. If it's a family you want, well, you know how much Lizzie wants a family.
Jesus, Mum, I didn't come here for marriage guidance. I just asked what you thought about a fucking house.
Stephen Appleton language.
Sorry, it's just that you have to understand, Kate is the most brilliant, extraordinary, wonderful person I've ever known. She's like no one else. The way she looks at things, it's like she has whole worlds inside her head. I don't think you or anyone really understands that.
If you were to go and look at my first video again, and look at, say, the meeting in the village hall with Jeremy, Meg, Charlie and Barbara, you'll notice that I've put it as the beginning of the event, even though they directly reference the quarantine being in effect. I don't have a meticulous, geometrically argued proof as to why that event should be a beginning event rather than a middle event. I just thought it seemed beginning-ish. I put the conversation with Meg, Charlie and Sam as the middle of the event, because that's the point at which that plot thread advances. I couldn't tell you exactly how long the middle lasts, and yet I've named the third period specifically as the last day, just because so many things seem to happen on what seems to be the day of the airstrike.
Physical changes are evident. Although the butterfly burn is now faded, I can clearly see the change in my pores up close. As I record these words, I can feel myself hearing them as if for the first time, as if I'm both speaker and listener simultaneously. I am a scientist. I can only deal with the evidence I have. And this points in one simple direction. It's not in the observatory. It's in me.
The logic works something like this. We know that the last day was also the day the children of Lakeside put on their show. We know that, for example, Sean and Di had already left at that point and baby Dylan was in Rachel's care. We also know that Charlie arrived at Lakeside, either on or just before that day. And we know that Charlie came to Lakeside on the way back from his supply trip to the warehouse. We put these things together, we add a dash of educated guesswork, and we kind of, sort of, have a timeline.
Kate, can you hear me? Listen, I'm trying to make things right. I've isolated myself. I'm in the old bunker at the substation. Just keep this band clear. If it's still alive, I'll try and check in every hour. Kate, I've convinced them to use the gas. I didn't know how else to stop it. I couldn't save them. Kate, it's in us, too. I've made arrangements for myself after the strike, after I finish the job. You need to think of that, too. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry about it all.
Of course, as is often the case when we try to tidily arrange things in lines, we find that there are actually multiple lines and things tend to get messy at the intersections. For example, when Charlie, Meg and Sam decided to go to the warehouse to pick up supplies, Sam already knew that Stephen was behind the thefts. Stephen, as is slowly starting to become apparent, didn't start stealing things until after he realised the quarantine wasn't going to hold. This means that Charlie, Meg and Sam's plan can't have been formed until fairly late into the chronology.
No phones, you know the protocol. That doesn't matter now. It's figured out how to circumvent the telecommunications blackout. What? I didn't think it could. Kate understood. She saw how adaptable it was. How smart.
Jesus Christ, you're talking about it like it's alive.
You have to assume that everyone here is infected.
We can't know that.
We're infected. It's killed all the birds, and now it's in us. It's trying to leave the valley any way it can. The quarantine is not enough. You've got to remove the carriers. You've got to cut off its energy source, its food.
I've already told you, Stephen, I'm not going to order
You
an
have
airstrike.
to. Now it knows we're onto it. It's going to keep on spreading as fast as it can.
The quarantine and blackout will hold it in check. They've cut all of the phones out of the valley, so it's only you communicating
Aren't
out
you
now.
listening? It's figured out ways around it. Radio waves, something. All of the lines are cut, but the phones are working anyway. You've done all the right things, but it's not enough. You've got to stop it before it adapts again.
Stephen, my family, my wife and kids.
You know perfectly well what you've got to do.
I can't do it. Don't ask me to do it. You're asking me to sign their death warrant, my own family.
Damn it, don't you think I'm aware of that? I'll still be here when you drop the fucking stuff. Don't you lecture me about sacrifice, you spineless little shit. If you're so full of ideas, you come here and try dealing with it. Tell them the time when we had a choice is over. Tell them to do it. You've got to do it now.
The exact timeline of the quarantine itself is also up for a certain amount of interpretation. We saw in Lizzie's chapter that the first wave of human disappearances took place in Lakeside. A conversation between Sean and Di specifically noted that 15 people had upped and left in 2 days. It therefore seems apparent that Sean and Di's escape attempt followed soon after. By this point, Sean and Di had already heard the official story that what was happening was a strain of flu, but they also said that the roads hadn't been closed yet. Their escape attempt failed due to colliding with Robert Graves on the road, and they returned to Lakeside. Shortly afterwards, they fought, and both left the camp, leaving baby Dylan behind. This all happened before, but presumably not very long before, Charlie arrived at the camp, which, as seems apparent from context, happened on the last day. So maybe the whole event panned out in less than a week.
You look well.
I don't. But thank you. You do. How are you settling in?
Nothing changes around here. I mean, it's great to be back. It still feels like home, I suppose. In a funny kind of way.
It's been a long time, Stephen. Last time you saw me, I could still walk properly.
You look pretty good to me.
Stop it.
For what it's worth, I'm sorry about how things worked out.
Or didn't.
Or didn't, right.
Do you think you made a mistake leaving?
My mum tells me it's never too late to change things. To put things right.
Funny. It's just what she said to me the other day. I have been wondering what she meant by that.
That's embarrassing. Sorry.
Maybe I should go.
Why?
Stephen, we're both married. I don't think this is a good idea.
What isn't? We're just two old friends having a drink, that's all.
And tying all of these interlocking plot threads together is Stephen. What he knew, what he feared, and when. Stephen was the person who first requested the quarantine when he realised what was happening to the birds and what was about to happen to the people. Later, the pattern started trying to spread itself over phone lines, and Stephen first realised that the quarantine was never going to hold forever. This is when Stephen made his first attempt to convince Clive to call in an airstrike. I believe that this is the point when Stephen hatched his plan to hide out through the airstrike in an underground bunker and started stealing supplies in order to help him do that. Later, Stephen found proof that the pattern was somehow still able to spread itself over long distances even without phones. This was what helped him finally convince Clive to order the airstrike, in a conversation which, as it happens, was overheard by Frank on his radio. Now, what Frank knew and when is kind of its own problem. Recall again his conversation with Jeremy, in which he tells him, oh, they'll send planes alright. Absent the knowledge that Frank is prone to believing in conspiracy theories, that statement seems to place that conversation after his discovery of Stephen's plot, when actually it's just Frank being Frank. Jeremy is a spanner in these works in and of himself. Recall again the finale of his chapter. Jeremy does not die during the airstrike. He dies from exposure to the pattern. But before doing so, he explicitly states, "You got them all." It seems that Jeremy thinks that everybody is dead. So how do we resolve this with the airstrike not having happened yet?
I've never seen it.
They do, though.
You're overreacting.
Stephen, they stare at me. Yesterday I went into the village and this old woman just stopped in the middle of the street and stared at me like I had two heads.
Oh, don't be so melodramatic.
I'm like a walking freak show. Oh, this place, it's so insular. I just don't understand how you grew up here.
Well, I was very different then. And they're not so bad, really.
That's easy for you to say.
Just give it a bloody chance, Kate. This was the deal. A year here, and we could be in with a real shot at Lucia.
Stephen!
Oh, Christ, it's Lantham.
Stephen Appleton, I thought it was you. What's all this about a young wife? Oh. Hello.
Two heads, Stephen. Hi, I'm Kate.
Placing Jeremy's death on our timeline requires, appropriately enough, one or two leaps of faith. I think that when Jeremy said "you got them all," he was talking about the inhabitants of the village rather than the whole valley. Neil and Amanda, Phil and Barbara, and a host of other characters we never actually meet. We know that Jeremy is aware of the kids at Lakeside and of Lizzie and Stephen's plans, but it's not completely absurd to suggest that he might have concluded that their days are numbered, and in the meantime, he's stuck in the village, alone. Certainly the game is again suffering for not having clarified something. Still though, we're able to make just about enough sense of what we have for us to plausibly place Jeremy's death on our timeline. Or at least within one of the periods that we've defined. Anyway, let's catch up with Lizzie.
Darling Stephen, I don't know if you'll ever listen to this. Maybe you've decided to stay with Kate, and I can't blame you for that. But I can't wait for you either. I've got to think about the baby. And, well, I should have left a long time ago. I've run out of excuses for not leaving now. But I do love you, Stephen. And I hope you find peace one way or another. Oh, there's planes coming.
Rather than continue to obsess over the intricacies of the timeline, let's instead turn our attention to Stephen. It seems faintly absurd to suggest, after Wendy and Lizzie's chapters, that Stephen is not himself to be the subject of a moral judgment by the player, given that he facilitated a mass murder. But the fact is, none of his actions, other than his part in unwittingly bringing the pattern to the village, are particularly immoral, or even irrational. It's arguably only because of Stephen that the pattern was contained at all, even if that containment was ultimately doomed to failure. On top of that, Stephen's no hypocrite. He's perfectly willing to sacrifice himself to save literally all of humanity.
Have they closed the tunnel?
There's no trains. I've put up a sign.
The tunnel, Howard, is it closed?
I think so. I don't like it. It's not right at all.
Stop whining, it doesn't help anyone. Did you know you're bleeding?
Oh, this headache is just killing me. I haven't had a nosebleed like this since I was a kid.
But you've not been to the village?
No, I've been here the last couple of days, or at home. I've only spoken to Clive at the EMC on the phone. Well, tried to anyway, but with all the crossed lines...
But no direct contact with any other people?
No, no one. What are you talking about? What's going on?
It's the pattern. It's adapted again. It doesn't need direct contact to transfer. It's using the phones!
What do you mean, direct contact? Stephen!
Ethicists are always interested in the applicability of scale and proportionality in moral judgments. There's a famous ethical thought experiment you might have heard of involving a train. What this thought experiment does and does not demonstrate about ethics is a subject of an essay or 5 for another time, but it almost always requires us to at least consider the possibility that the number of deaths might be more important than their mode.
This is Catherine Collins, recording for posterity. It's all over. I don't know how long I've got. Whatever he did, whatever the planes were carrying, it's burning my lungs. Probably some kind of nerve agent. I suspect it's only exposure to the pattern that has kept me alive this long. I'm making my way to Tower 6. I'm going to fuse the signals from the optical array. I just hope I can make it.
Conversely, logicians have a concept called fuzzy logic, in which we agree that there being one cloud in the sky does not make it a cloudy day, and there being 1,000 clouds in the sky does. But we can't precisely define the exact number of clouds at which the day starts being cloudy. We all agree that the exact number of clouds matters, but often we're more interested in which side of the theoretical tipping point we're on than exactly where it is.
Hello? Hello, is there anyone there? Can anyone hear me? Clive? Clive, it's Stephen Appleton. Are you there? Can you hear me? Over. Come on, Clive, where are you? Damn it. Stephen. Come in Tower 6. Kate, are you there? Kate? Anyone? Hello? Can anyone hear me? This is Dr. Stephen Appleton broadcasting from within the quarantine zone. Can anybody hear me? Oh, God, no. No. Fucking hell, no!
The reason this is relevant is this. If proportionality matters at all to this judgment, we might be able to say that, say, causing one death directly in order to prevent 2 is wrong, and maybe causing one death in order to prevent 4 is also wrong, but by virtue of proportionality, less wrong. We must, in that case, accept that there exists a tipping point somewhere between 4 and, say, 7 billion, where it stops being wrong and starts being justified.
You're a daft old bird walking all the way out here for it. You know Charlie would have dropped it off.
What, and have that stinking great lorry of his poisoning my birds? He shouldn't be driving it on these lanes, it's a hazard.
I think he was hoping he could have a word with you about Frank.
There's nothing to say.
Oh, listen, Wendy, they might all be scared of you, but that's not going to work with me. You're 68 years old. Grow up. Talk to Frank.
How dare you speak to me like that? Give me my bird feeder right now.
Promise me you'll drop by and see your brother.
Megan Holloway, give
Not a chance. Promise me. It's for your own good, and you know it.
You are a shamelessly manipulative and difficult woman. It's no wonder Charlie adores you so much.
No wonder I do what?
No wonder you never finish what you start. I thought I told you to check the incoming stock orders. Wendy, 1 bird feeder for you. I'll tell Frank you'll stop by.
Oh!
Charlie, stop mooning around and stick the kettle on. Make yourself useful.
There is a range of moral ends and means within which discussions of the moral value relatively of ends versus means has any meaning. And the apocalyptic stakes at play in Stephen's decision tilt that scale so completely that discussing it at all in moral terms of ends versus means is just plain absurd. It isn't in proportion. The idea that we're supposed to be judging Stephen quite literally does not add up. In which case, what actually is supposed to be the central drama of Stephen's story? He's tied up in his share of character drama, of course, but that's also not really in proportion. Rather, Stephen's chapter is where Rapture finally decides to start telling a story about the apocalypse.
Appleton!
What are you doing here?
You thieving bastard, I knew it was you.
Listen, take everything you need, but then you have to leave. You don't understand, you can't be near me.
Painting your stupid little pictures. Stealing food. You always were a little prick.
Please, every second we're in proximity makes it worse. I'm a primary conduit.
You're a fucking disgrace. Come here!
Don't touch me, get off!
What's going on?
Come in here, lord
Jesus,
it over
Sam!
us! Thinking you're so much better
Sam,
than the
leave
rest
him!
of us.
No physical
you
contact!
and your stupid fucking missus!
stop
She's
it!
better than any of you! Sam? Meg, please.
Don't come near me.
Meg!
Charlie!
Meg, wait!
Don't touch me!
Please, you have to understand, it was an accident!
Let go, let's just go.
Charlie, you have to understand, it was an accident.
Just leave him. Leave him.
What have you done, Appleton, you bastard?
Come on, Charlie, let's just
Meg,
get out of
Charlie,
here.
please!
The elephant in Rapture's room is how infrequently it directly addresses the event that drives most of its plot. To most of its cast, even most of its central characters, the pattern might as well be the flu. Some, like Jeremy, come close to grasping the enormity of what it is. But ultimately, for the most part, the pattern isn't really meaningfully any different from any other large event that might have shaken the tree of humanity hard enough for some drama to fall out of it.
Station Master's house, Howard Lantham speaking. Howard, it's Clive. Clive Smith. I need you to listen to me and not ask questions or interrupt. Can you do that?
Yeah, I can. But why are you calling?
The Emergency Measures Committee is imposing a quarantine around the valley. We've got an influenza outbreak in the village. We're suspending rail services, and we're also going to be shutting down the roads for a bit. You're going to be dealing with some anxious people, Howard, so you need to explain it's all under control, and we'll be back to normal in a few days. All right? Open up the emergency store. There's posters and boards, along with a bunch of stuff that hasn't been used since the war. Grab anything you think might be useful. I need you to close up any unoccupied buildings, put posters up, that sort of thing. Make sure everything is all squared away and shipshape. You are a military man, I'm sure you understand that. Everyone doing their bit, following their orders. All right?
All right, I think.
Good man. I knew we could count on you.
Ah, Jesus, Maze. What the hell was that?
Stephen is the only person in the valley with any idea of the apocalyptic stakes at play, and his story, if it's about anything at all, is about the 3 or 4 layers of dramatic irony resulting from this fact. He, like us, is aware that everybody around him is doomed and that they have no idea of it. He sees the efforts they're going to and knows that none of them matter. He could tell them, but he knows that wouldn't really matter either. He has a plan to heroically save the world, but not only will he not live to see it, nobody will even know what he did, and he won't even be the one who pressed the button in the end. That will be Clive. And even here, now, we know something that Stephen doesn't. That even his last plan is doomed to failure. Stephen's is a story about being forced to accept an extent of nihilism in order to prevent an apocalypse. How many levels of dramatic irony are we on? Well, here's one more. When provoked by Sam in the warehouse, Stephen just continues to spout his usual technobabble about wanting to prevent exposure to the pattern. It isn't until Sam insults Kate that Stephen becomes enraged and attacks and kills him. Because the final irony is, even when nothing matters, these things still matter. Stephen's story is about engaging with the apocalypse, and about what that does and does not mean. Apocalypse fiction, like any fiction that purports to not just be about people, is ultimately about people. A story about the apocalypse is a story about how people act in the face of this unprecedented finality. More abstractly, it's about people deciding what would be the last thing that matters to them, if it were to be the last thing that ever mattered. Rapture gives us a story in which all of this is still true, but in which only one man understands that it's an apocalypse story.
Repeating over and over to myself in the dark, eating cold food from a can with my fingers. My name is Catherine Collins. I am Catherine Collins. As if I can force the world to acknowledge my existence. Time has ceased to exist in any real terms. I'm reduced to marking out the days on the walls. Like a cave woman.
Jeremy, Wendy, Frank, and Lizzie are all informed by a sense of ongoing crisis, and their plots are definitely driven by the apocalyptic events that are occurring. Each of them attains some personal clarity. Jeremy on his faith, Wendy on her grief, Frank on his cowardice, and Lizzie on her attachment, in the course of these events. Their stories variously have themes and meanings and fodder for analysis, as I hope I've helped a little to demonstrate. These meanings are valid, but exist quite independently of their context against the end of the world, the context in which Rapture seems to want us to hold them. And that's weird, right? I genuinely don't know how I feel about this. I love the idea of an apocalypse story in which only one person realizes that it's the apocalypse. I love the elegance with which Stephen has been written into the absurd dilemma in which he finds himself. I certainly don't dislike the 4 other stories, Jeremy's timeline and Lizzie's starting situation notwithstanding. And the worst part is, I can't quite put into words exactly what it is that I don't like about the totality of all this without making reference to some imagined idea of how it should be. There's a vague sense of a discord between Stephen's story and the 4 other stories. It seems, intuitively, and to me at least, as though a story like Stephen's, about the only person on Earth who's aware that there's an apocalypse going on, ought to be primarily, if not entirely, about that person. It also seems to me as though if the inciting event in a person's character story happens to be the end of the world, then this fact should be relevant. It should inform that story somehow. At the very least, the character should know about it. Right? I suppose there are worse problems for a story like this to have. The messages not ringing true, the characters not making any sense, or the whole thing just being boring. Rapture doesn't have any of those problems. Tasked with being the devil's advocate, it's all I can do to nitpick about staffing, and to beg questions about the stories not fitting together right. It seems unfair to say that a good and meaningful story set against the end of the world should be considered to be flawed just because it might plausibly have been set against something else. But it bothers me all the same. And it bothers me that it bothers me. And it especially bothers me that I cannot articulate why it bothers me, using the cold, detached, unfeeling language of pure rationality, in which I wish I could articulate why it bothers me. Times like this remind me that I'm not actually a finely tuned video game analysis machine, with precision calibrated opinion circuitry and full array blinding insight panels. I'm just a human with feelings and ideas, trying to muster up the faintest semblance of authority with which to speak about a work of art, multifaceted and complicated, made by other humans with ideas and feelings, so as to produce a further derivative work for further consumption by further humans. I don't like being reminded of this.
Jesus, man, what have you done to your face?
It's nothing. You collecting feed? Looks like the supplies haven't been coming in.
Again?
These phones are all strange. I can't pinpoint the logic of transmission.
You what? What are you doing with that paint?
Means the EMC are actually moving at the proper speed. Listen, Frank. Have you heard anything on the radio about a flu outbreak?
Doesn't seem much like flu to me.
They're shutting down access to the valley to try and isolate it. No, there's something about the phones. I can't put my finger on it quite yet.
What are you talking about? Hey, I'm still talking to you. Where are you going?
I suppose there's something to be said for the notion that sometimes it's possible for a story to be too elegant. For the themes and the drama and the morals to fit together a little too tidily. For the caution in construction to start seeming like artifice and to detract from verisimilitude. Life, after all, is messy and doesn't have themes and morals and meanings. That I know of, anyway. It isn't the height of unreason, then, to suggest that there might be a story of one man's struggle against the apocalypse, which happens to spur into resolution other lives that are already in motion. Maybe it's right to observe that the pieces don't fit. Maybe it's right, and good.
It's all over the valley. Don't you get that? This isn't some abstract thing. Whatever came down into the tower has got out. They've quarantined the whole valley.
It's right here in the observatory.
It's out in the world. It's adapting and spreading. Do you understand?
No, we can't turn it away. It's come too far.
Okay, people are disappearing. Shut it down now.
No. If you won't help me, I'll do it on my own. I'm gonna route all the power back through Tower 6. Wait. It's trying to break through again.
Okay. Wait.
This, by the way, is finally the other side of that gate that I found back in the third video, the one that I could hear the ringing phone on the other side of. And this is what it looks like when you just walk ordinarily between areas, rather than going through that nighttime between chapters phase. From a pure game design perspective, it might not have been the best idea to put a time of day transition point directly into a wide open vista, covered in complex vegetation, in your CryEngine game with real-time global illumination. Maybe. That said, ironically, it seems to be the handful of places where the developers have chosen to use pre-baked shadows that fare the worst during these transitions. Video games, man. All told, the backroutes between areas cause more problems than they solve. Unless you're hunting for the weird arbitrary achievements that don't need to be in the game, there's no reason to want to do the thing that they let you do. And doing that thing puts some undue strain on the game's otherwise excellent lighting engine and causes you to notice all of the ways in which it doesn't quite work. Things that you'd never have noticed otherwise.
This was a mistake.
What do you want me to say? You knew what you were getting into.
Really?
Well, I'm sorry we don't measure up to your exacting standards, Dr. Collins. Maybe you just need to give us ordinary humans a break.
What? Ordinary humans like Lizzie Graves? Did you really think that I wouldn't find out? Frank told me. Or did you forget there's one person in this shithole who actually talks to me?
Kate, it was just a drink.
Don't bother, Stephen!
Oh, for Christ's sake. Kate, slow down.
You were engaged to her, Stephen. You nearly married her.
Oh, come on, it was just a drink.
Then why the hell did you lie to me about it?
Because I knew you'd be mad and then it would end up in a row. You wanted to focus on the event tonight.
Oh, so you were actually doing me a favor. Wow, I guess I just forgot to say thank you. Do not treat me like I'm an idiot.
You're overreacting. I know you're stressed.
Just don't. Just keep away from me. I'm not gonna let you ruin this for me.
Kate. Kate, come on, this is crazy.
Given everything I've already said about the timeline, you'll understand that I can't be completely certain of this, but I'm pretty sure that the conversation we just saw happens almost immediately before the first conversation we saw in the game, the one outside the observatory gates with Graham. This means I've kind of sort of managed to bookend the 5 main chapters with Stephen and Kate's fight over Lizzie. I suppose the developers intended it to occur to us that a lot of this might have played out quite differently had Stephen and Kate not fought. Had he not cheated on her, or had she simply not found out?
Pressure in my eyes again. I can't move my legs, can't feel my face. When I collapsed, the light was waiting for me there. Caught me, lowered me here. Now it's pooling around my feet, watching me. The printers are spewing out page after page of zeros. It's frightened too. It'll be okay. It'll be fine. I'll look after you. It's alone. It's scared. Oh, it's traveled so far. It's okay. I can help you. We can be together now. 10 seconds to signal fusion. We can be together. 3 seconds. 2.
This is the end of Stephen's chapter, and the one and only true point of no return in the game. I imagine most players will have a pretty solid idea of what we're going to witness inside this bunker. But just to be safe, I'm going to reiterate that there is a content warning attached to this video. It's repeated down in the description.
When I was a kid, my dad found a fox. It had been hit by a car and couldn't walk anymore. My mum went spare, of course, made him keep it in the shed. He was already slipping away from us then. He spent hours with that fox, telling it all about Italy and the villages they bombed there. I was jealous, I think. That the fox got more of my dad than I did. But it was dying, that was clear. So one day, I snuck out, took it a sandwich for food. I was only 8. When it bit me, I remember the anger, the shock, the hurt. Running in, screaming from the garden, my mum panicking about rabies. My dad beat it to death with a spade. Later I found him crying. I'd done it, Ken's son. That's what he said. I'd done it, Ken, it was hurting you. That's just a poor, dumb, dying animal. It doesn't know it's hurting us. Christ help us, it's left the valley. It's everywhere now. It's been 3 hours since the planes went over. I haven't been able to reach anyone on the shortwave. I'm beginning to think I may have made a terrible miscalculation. You understand me, don't you? Well, there's no one left. Just me. You know what this is? What I'm gonna do? You want light? Fine. I'll give you light. After me, there's no one. You'll be all alone again. Forever. Like before. You've taken everyone I've ever loved from me. You've made me do things I never even thought I was capable of. But if you think I'm coming with you... Kate? Wait. Stop. Kate.
This is Catherine Collins. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this. It's all over. I'm the only one left.